Art Museum. My name is Maggie Ocean. Today's event is sponsored with Art Museum and with the National Association for Armenian Studies. I have to apologize for the delay, but my speaker hasn't showed up yet. So if we don't have a speaker, but we have a nice music with Vajay Mondarian and Miss Terian May, and so afterwards we'll be following to the reception unless Dr. Dekmejan volunteers to take over Dr. Abraham Terian's place. I apologize, but he said he's going to drive from Fresno, Dr. Terian, and he's going to come directly from Fresno. So now I hear that there's some issues on the grapevine, so I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. He's one of my favorite scholars, of all the scholars I've known, and this would have been his second presentation. Today's event is the program is going to be a little bit different. Of course, we had the month of April, and I usually don't have events because of the commemorations we had. But the museum was involved in an event at the Northridge Academy High School, which is one of the high schools, which is in the campus of California State University, Northridge. I was approached by Miss, I'm sorry, I went blank for a second. It will come to me. By one of their instructors, an Armenian teacher, who said the Armenian Club wants to organize a commemoration on the campus. And she asked me if I could help her with a traveling exhibit as well as also some speakers. So my job was very easy: organize a travel exhibit and invite some speakers. Little did I know that in 20 years that I've been working in the museum, I have never seen a program so rich, so well prepared by 10 students, 9th graders to 12th graders, for the entire school. The entire campus is 1,100 students. Out of that, 600 students showed up for 3 events. Each event was 200 students, prepared by those young kids that you see right in the front row sitting there. And it wasn't only a program of a PowerPoint presentation. They even had a Jeopardy game so that the students can interact to know more about the Armenian history, the geography, what kind of food we eat, and the questions were part of the PowerPoint presentation, so there were more interaction with the students. I was walking around during the program to see if anyone was sleeping, was playing with the phone. There was not one student on the phone. Everybody was very attentive. Our speakers were Dr. K. Moravian. She showed the movie My Mother's Voice, and Magic Iranian, a cultural destruction on the Armenian genocide. I have to thank Nairi, the teacher. Nairi, I forgot your name. I'm sorry because I'm a little bit nervous today because I'm my speaker. She did an outstanding program. She was the teacher of the month at the Northridge Academy High School, and also she was a teacher of the year at the Northridge, I think California, if I'm not mistaken. She did an outstanding program. I was amazed. I couldn't have done what she had done. So in appreciation, I invited the students over, so let's give them a big hand. Why don't you guys come over? And the teachers. And Galina too. Galina too. This was the promise that the kids made that every year they're going to commemorate. It was an assembly of 200 students for 3 sessions all day long. They had 8 classes of history classes, so the teacher had to agree to give up their sessions so the students can come and learn about the Armenian genocide and the future, or not future, but past genocides. So thank you very much. In appreciation, we have small certificates from Art Museum. This is Armenian Genocide Awareness at Northridge Academy High School, Armenian Club Informational Assemblies. Thank you for your great work organizing and hosting the 102nd commemoration of the genocide on April 21st, 2017. So I will pass it to your teacher to pass your certificates, and we also have small gifts for you. The ladies will receive a book on Aurora Martiganian, who was an iconic figure that went through the atrocities of the Armenian genocide. She was in the silent movies. She was a patient of the Ararat home, room number 5. Eventually she died at the hospital, and her burial place is unknown. Actually, she was buried with over 500 people. Nobody had claimed her body. But we will know more about her, who she is, and there will be more documentaries coming about her. And as well for the boys, we do have a book about the Armenian athletic group. It's in English, and it was, both books were published by the Genocide Museum in Armenia. I want to say thank you. My hand goes out to you, Nairi. You're an exceptional person. You've touched me in many ways that I cannot explain to you. I'm so emotional. Thank you. Thank you again.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Norwich Academy High School and our student body and my students, I would like to thank our Eskidjan Museum and especially Maggie Goshchin for giving us this opportunity to learn and to inspire our students, because she did an amazing job herself. She brought the entire museum collection to our school to introduce students to the museum, and she introduced us to the wonderful speakers. You probably heard of, she mentioned already Dr. Kay Moredan and her book, My Mother's Voice, which we watched the documentary. Students enjoyed it really much, and it gives us in the background. And just to have students to be connected to Armenian history, I think it's very, very important. And I think they should be proud of themselves, because they had a touch of their classmates and to their student body to teach them about a piece of Armenian history. Thank you.
We do have a musical program, and I have to thank Bachi Mangarian, always coming to my rescue. And this time, because we don't have a piano in the chapel, which hopefully we will have soon, he will be playing the organ for a change. And I have to thank Garine Avakian will be joining Bachi. And if my speaker doesn't show up, Dr. Dekmejian, you are on plan B, I'm sorry to say. Not that I'm sorry to say, but I'm sorry. I don't have his cell number. I don't know what happened, so I'm sorry. Thank you, Bachi.
Good afternoon, everyone. In my remarks a few months ago at the Hajj conference presented by the Eskidjan Museum, I confessed that when my dear friend Maggie Mangasarian Goshen invited me to present a musical program relating to the music of Cilicia and in particular Hajj, she set me off on a treasure hunt. Little did I realize that I would be embarking on yet another treasure hunt when I signed on to present a short program of Grigor Naregatsi's Odes, Damer, with my colleague Garine Avakian. The search would involve a foray into voluminous material for if Armenian church music, with its vast discovered and undiscovered repertoire, can be equated to a musical universe, then Naregatsi's work would certainly be a galaxy within that universe. I began my research with, among many books, the important volume by Nigoros Ahmisian's titled Grigor Naregatsin Yev Haile Rajtuna, Hingen Das Nigerov Tarun, Grigor Naregatsi and the Armenian music from 5th through the 15th centuries. To explain in the simplest form, Naregatsi's, like most sacred Armenian music, is modal music. It does not fit within the 18th or 19th century European tonal musical structure. In the late 18th and throughout the 19th century, when Armenian church music, including Naregatsis, written with Armenian neumes notation, chazer, was being converted into European notation, the melodic and harmonic structure was altered to fit the European tonal structure. Some composers have gone further to come up with accompaniments utilizing major and minor harmonies. However, not all music of the Armenian Church, as I mentioned earlier, being modal music, can fit within the major or minor harmonic format. The advantage that 20th or 21st century composers have is that they can use atonal or even polytonal structure in modifying modal music for contemporary transcription. For today's performance, we will present 3 odes, Dager, by Naregatsi. I tried to find music, the music of odes that are translated by Dr. Terian in his book, However, I was unable to locate a book that had the collected songs of Naregatsi. Therefore, we will present in the following order: Ahev Sinus, Sayan an Ichaner, and probably Naregatsi's most well-known ode, Havun Havun. The last two are translated in Dr. Terian's book. Garin Avakel and I decided to perform the songs almost a cappella. I say almost because the organ in accompanying the vocalist will only hold a drone rather than playing a complete accompanying part. However, I could not resist the challenge of coming up with an original accompaniment for at least one of the odes. Therefore, after performing one verse of Havun Havun almost a cappella, we will repeat it with what I'm considering a first draft of my accompaniment for this famous ode. Thank you. Karine. One more disclaimer. I haven't played the organ in many years.
course, we had a change of program plan B. Dr. Dekmejian is going to step in. I'm sorry for this, but I'm happy that you're here, that you're going to save our day, Dr. Dekmejian. I don't have your bio, I'm sorry. I appreciate it.
And of course, the speaker, who's an incredible professor in the field that he's written so many important books on. Well, people, what can I tell you? With Dr. Vache Vankerian and the singer, whose name I forgot, Garine, but I forgot the last name. Anyway, you know, a few weeks ago I stopped conducting a choir in one church. And then today I went to another church and the choir director had fallen sick, so they dragged me to conduct the choir. And then I come here and I developed between these two professionals. You know, I'm just not a professional. But here are two people who gave me, in this beautiful music, an inferiority complex after my conducting. So, what can we talk about? We can talk about all kinds of things. We can talk about issues having to do with the Armenian Church, and there are a lot of things to talk about there. Or we can talk about some of the things I've been doing. Of course, I'm delighted to see one of our own graduates, Dr. Vache, USC graduate, you know, he got a PhD, and you had two. Oh my God. Well, people, I have to tell you, last Wednesday, I finally say, as they say in Krapar, Gazis Rajaryan. Gazis Rajaryan in Krapar means, have me resigned. So they gave me a party on campus, the president and so on. So anyway, because I had to leave, I was losing my mind and I had a number of very, very complex issues to finish, having to do with my field, which has to do with hell's breaking loose in the world. That's my field. And I've taught that field for a long time. And therefore, and I had to finish some deadlines I have. That's why I'm hiding. I've been hiding and I have to hide for another 3 months to finish a study for various people in Washington and elsewhere. You've heard about the Middle East, right? Yeah. So you can talk about the Middle East as well. You can talk about Armenian issues. And we do have a lot of issues, and my wife is raising her hand. Yes, yes, ma'am. Who? Naregatsi, me? Well, no, I don't have anything written, you know. Well, Naregatsi, I've certainly followed Naregatsi a great deal. You know, in the church, I've been an archdeacon for many, many years. And I love the Armenian Church and our Badaraks. And going back to Armenian history and, of course, Naregatsi and Shnorali, there's no way you can match them. And the man who was going to speak to you today, I'm sure he was going to talk about Naregatsi, among other things. So we better not talk about Naregatsi, Anush, because the speaker was going to come, and I prayed he will come. So he'll be talking about Naregatsi. Shnorali, of course, also a very exceptional fellow, but I spoke about the Shnorali a few years ago. Shnorali is a very unique person, not only a brilliant Catholicos, but also Shnorali was, of course, a musician, a theorist, you know, in terms of, you know, the community, the prayer, you know, community, that is the people who were trying to destroy the Armenian Church. He was a Giligetsi, of course, and he had taken the Catholicosate and put it on a rock near Sis today. It's about a couple of hours. And that rock, that's where, and that rock was not so simply a Catholicosate, but also the rock was for the defense. And therefore, he had an army around that huge rock. And he used to compose things for those boys to stay awake, the guards. One of which, of course, is what? Anyone for an A+ guys? I gave so many A+, by the way. One of the problems was to write recommendations. 31 years of teaching at USC. I left with, I really didn't want to leave. And they didn't want me to leave. But with tears, and my colleague is here, please stand up, from the anthropology department, books and so on and so forth. Boy, he's the best. But he produced.
Long before him.
Yes, when I got there.
I've been urging him to be better. I'm happy that you are.
Well, I feel weird if I can't teach. So that I'm in, having tears and so on and so forth, but I've got to finish the grant. The grant has to do with why people kill each other, especially in the Middle East, and how we can prevent that, and so on and so forth. That's a field that I've been into way back when I used to work for the government after I left the military. Not the American military, but the American military. So, now, coming to our, not Naregatsi, but Shnorhari. What was that thing that he composed to keep the guards at night? Who? Not Arabot Musa? No, not Arabot Hoslani. Ishesuk ikisheri sanun koder. Ishesuk ikisheri sanun koder. Փոխեցեն սիր մեզ փամփարի և դզուկ մեզ բաբեցեն և դավոր թակավորին, and so on and so forth. And they sang that soldier by soldier as they went, including other sharagans as well, and I'm sure they sang Arabot Dusa as well. Or in sad circumstances, another one of these I-thank-you, sharagans, like Arabot Dusa, you see, and what was that? Ashkara, he gets an A+. Ashkara Benayn. Ashkara Benayn, Aris Valja, Varzagits Lesbun, Azarasbun. Divine man. So we sing that when we have Huargavol tune. Huargavol tune is, when an Armenian faithful is going to be buried in him. So, any questions you would like to, how to get into USC? I can tell you how to get into law school, another thing, your PhDs and so on, and so medical school maybe, anyway. And I don't charge. So, yes, lady?
What, in your opinion, is the greatest challenge facing the Armenian Apostolic Church, and what recommendations?
That sounds like a very important question that I don't hear. You know why?
31 years.
Pardon?
Hearing.
Can you repeat that, please?
What is the greatest challenge facing the Armenian Apostolic Church?
What's the greatest challenge? Yeah, the greatest challenge facing the Armenian Apostolic Church is Ego? Yeah. Well, that's always a problem, but I think there are other issues as well. The Armenian Apostolic Church, I gave a speech at the diocese about a month ago where Father Vaskin had a conference about the Armenian Apostolic Church and what was wrong, what was right. There are many strong things. We have to realize that if the Armenian people want to sustain themselves, okay, they have to look at the Armenian Church as an ideology. In other words, the Christianity we have is Armenian Christianity. That's always been our national anthem. I'm sorry I don't have a speech, but I'll show you the proofs. In that speech, by the way, there were things that the Armenian Christianity has done in the past and stopped doing. For example, a very easy thing, women. You know, Armenian women have been a part of the church since the beginning, when the church was established. The Pope has told us, the Pope is not Armenian, okay? He loves Armenians though. He went to Armenia. He celebrated April 24th, 2 years ago, in the Vatican. He keeps on telling our leaders all kinds of things. They should listen to him, such as feed the poor. The Armenian church does not feed the poor. One church did, the one that Father Vaskin established. And that's why I worked freely for 30 years, precisely because Father Vaskin's church, especially the women, they fed the poor all over the place, including Glendale, but way beyond Glendale. But women, did you know that 10 years ago, one of our last women, Sargavax, deaconesses, passed away in Istanbul. Okay? We don't have any left around the world. Why? Ask the two Catholicoi, both of whom I've met. Okay? Why break the rules of the Armenian Church? The Armenian Church is expected to have women as deaconesses, women who go to the altar, women who serve the Badarakich, women who are nuns.
Academy of Sciences of the Republic of Armenia and Fellow of the Ambassador Ambrosian and Academy of Milan. He has extensive publications in the fields of Hellenistic, early Christian, and classical Armenian literature. Are you up to it, Dr. Kelly, or do you need more time? You're okay? Okay, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Maggie. And thank you all for coming and also for waiting. This was rather unexpected. We were caught for 1.5 hours for what otherwise would have taken 5 minutes to cover that distance. And fortunately, my wife and I, who happens to be with me, Sarah, we had allowed 1.5 hours of spare time. And that's exactly what it took in that traffic jam. So we made it. We just parked here exactly at 5 o'clock. Good to be with you, and it's always a delight to talk on Armenian subjects, especially in an Armenian environment. Ever so often, I get to speak about Armenian things to non-Armenians, but how much more I feel at home when I speak to Armenian audiences. Again, thank you for waiting. and as believers in divine providence, here we are. I've been asked to speak just a little bit about my book, and then the better part of my time, though I was not told when to quit, but I'll try to quit before your patience is worn out. I'll talk about certain things we have to bear in mind or to be aware of or be knowledgeable of in order to understand Saint Gregory of Narek. This is very important because every Armenian who has read Saint Gregory of Narek is infused by the rhythm and the musical intonations and alliteration in his writing to the point that I know of no Armenian who wouldn't say that listening to any recitation or reading of Saint Gregory of Narek is not music to the ears. So we all love to hear that beautiful Karapar, the classical Armenian, the very language of the 10th century Naregatsi. In translation, of course, we do have more than 30 translations of his major work, the Madhyan Vohperkutyan, which is his prayer book. The way Madhyan Vohperkutyan has been ever so often translated leaves something to be desired. Now, literally, of course, it is Book of Lamentations. Another English translator has it Book of Sadness, but either translation leaves something to be wanting because Vohperkutyan in Armenian could also mean penitential prayer. So, in effect, it is a book of penitential prayers. One can also say it is not just a book of prayers, they are discourses with God. Even the very subheadings before each prayer, Chosk and Astudzo, it's like having a dialogue with God. One interesting thing would be to read Saint Gregory of Narek with special attention to question marks. He is, in effect, dialoguing with God. And the questions, of course, are questions of theodicy. God being who He is, humans being who we are, mortal as we are, weak as we are, earthly as we are, in contrast with divine beings and with God Himself. Of course, the contrast is much to be desired. If one is ever justified to draw any contrast between us humans and the divine. But be that as it may, it's a dialogue with God. So it's more than a conversation with God, it's more than a prayer to God, even if we define prayer as speaking to God or with God. So the prayers of Saint Gregory of Narek are quite broad in definition, and they are not prayers in the strictest sense of the word. Those who take them in the strictest sense of the word, of course, even as penitential prayers, for some people who understand what they're reading, or if they were to read Naregatsi in translation, dare I say they are somewhat depressing, because penance or penitence is not all that enthusiastic expression. But be that as it may, the book I published, and which you probably noticed as you walked in, the festal works of Saint Gregory of Narek, are his special compositions, not as prayers as such, but as chants litanies, petitions, and panegyrics, or encomia, which literally means praise. So what I have in the book, some 460 pages, if you count the 60-page introduction that I have, is the exact opposite of the penitential prayers. And how did these writings come about? If I were an abbot of a monastery, like the monastery of Narek, and I'm taking it for granted that you know a little bit about St. Gregory of Narek and where the monastery was, just in case you don't, if you were to look at any map of Lake Van, look at the southern shore and take the southernmost point of the southern shore, that's where the monastery of Narek was, just about 3 miles inland from the shore. And even as we look at Lake Van and the whole surrounding of Lake Van, we could just as well say St. Gregory of Narek, in a broader definition or identity, would be a Vanetsi. And the monastery was founded very early in the 10th century. It thrived around the middle of the 10th century. And as for St. Gregory of Narek, he was born probably in 945 and died in 1003. He was orphaned of his mother very early in life, so the father, who upon becoming a widower, received episcopal ordination and became a bishop. Bishop of Antsevatsiats. Antsevatsiats would be the northeastern side of Lake Van. It was one of the Armenian provinces, a very dynastic identity, for which he became the bishop. So as he became a bishop with 3 boys who were orphaned of their mother, Khosrov, the father, the bishop of Antsevatsik or Antsevatsiats, kept his eldest son, whose name was Savak, as his assistant, and took the 2 younger boys to be cared for by the abbot and founder of the monastery. His name was Ananya. And this Ananya happens to be a cousin of the deceased mother of the boys. A cousin on her paternal side. Now, what is so amazing about this monastery is that it was so advanced in its theology, and when we take into account the writings of most everybody we know from that monastery, from the 10th and into the turn of the 11th century, including writings by the abbot Ananya himself, we are really amazed at the enormity of religious education and of the things that were taking place at the monastery of Narek. There's a historian who was a contemporary and conceivably a classmate of St. Gregory of Narek. It's the historian Asovi, or Stephanos Asovi, who tells us that this monastery was very renowned for its music. This is in addition to the deep theology that we encounter in the writings of whoever we know of Narek in the 10th century. So, musically speaking, this was a very interesting place. In fact, in these festal works of Saint Gregory of Narek, his doves, his odes were to be chanted. Not just a solo, to begin with, by himself, because the composer was also the singer. But some were for communal singing, and in several of these odes, he talks about singing in circle and the rejoicing that they experienced as enthusiastic singers in this monastery of Narek. So, why did I write this book? Again, as a believer in divine providence, I must say it just came to be. At St. Mercedes Seminary, where I taught for 12 years, beside being the academic dean, the instruction at the seminary we have is all in English. And by the way, it's the only Armenian seminary that admits only those with a college degree, or the equivalent of 4-year university education. So our instruction is in English. We have a joint accredited Master of Divinity program with our sister seminary, a Russian Orthodox seminary by the name of St. Vladimir's, just 10 miles away from where we're located in Armonk, New York. So our instruction is in English, but the subject that we teach is all Armenian, and our sources are in Armenian. So what do we do as teachers when there are no English textbooks for the things we teach in English? So we teachers, from class to class, translate our sources and give them to our students as handouts. So over the years, you can imagine that some of these translated works accumulate, and one could staple them and write an introduction, and you have a book. Well, it takes a little bit more work than just that, but the book covers all of St. Gregory's odes, all of his litanies, and all of his panegyrics. In Armenian, they're called Yan or Koves. Now, the occasions were all festal occasions for which these writings were composed. So if I were to be the abbot of the monastery of Narek, and the feast is around the corner, be it in a week or in a month or within a few months, the abbot would ask one of the monks, obviously the most illustrious among them, to compose something for the impending feast. So let's say Christmas is around the corner, or the feast of Vartavar is around the corner, Ayla Gerbatun, the feast of Transfiguration, or the Ascension of Christ, or the resurrection of Lazarus, or any of the feasts of the Blessed Virgin Mary. The abbot would ask a monk to compose something for them to celebrate with on the pre-feast day. Now, in Armenian, for the major feasts, especially the Dominical feast, that is to say, feasts connected with the life of Christ, in the major feasts, we have pre-feast. The word in Armenian is Nachadonank. And for the Nachadonank, there was opportunity for creative worship. You know, in the Armenian church today, there's no room for creative worship. You know, everything is defined. You go by the book, be it the Badarak, be it whatever. Even the liturgy of the hours, everything is prefigured in print and you follow the book. Unless you know things by heart, but that's what you do. The medieval Armenian church, more so in the first millennium of Armenian Christianity, it wasn't like that. Worship in the Armenian church was just as much creative worship, especially on the pre-feast celebrations. So the monks would gather in a circle, would chant this new hymn. We'll use this newly written litany, and these litanies are really unique. Unique in that a litany is petitions usually read by a deacon. And for every petition made or a sentence recited, there is a response, like there or yeah, or so be it, or amen. And the deacon pronounces a petition in a sentence or in a line, and then there is a response in a word or two. These are not litanies like that. These litanies actually consist of 3 parts. The first part of the litany is a theological lesson or summary about the feast. What is it that we are celebrating? So there is an instructive, educational side to these litanies. And then comes the petitions, and at the end of it, we have Machtank. This part of the litany in the Armenian church today is reserved for the most senior person among the clergy who are in worship. And the Machtank asks for God to protect the hierarchs, the kings, the armies at war, our young men at arms, and on, down to the least of the worshippers. And these litanies have a very interesting word in Armenian. The Armenian word for these litanies is kants. And so the collection of these litanies is called Kantsaran. And the collection of the odes is called Dalaran. And if we take the Dalaran and the Kantsaran together, believe it or not, we have twice as many compositions as in the Armenian Sharak notes or the Sharagans. And so these are para-canonical Sharagans. And the reason they are not part of the regular Sharag notes or the hymnal of the Armenian church is because nearly half of the contributions in the Sharag notes are those of Saint Nerses Shnorhali, the Catholicos of the 12th century, Saint Nerses the Gracious, and his kin. And there are several of his kin who succeeded him as Catholicos. And so by the time their compositions were accommodated in the Sharag notes, one would say enough is enough. And so the Sharag notes, the hymnal of the Armenian church, is quite a massive volume in and of itself. So these other odes or hymns and cantos and encomia were collected separately. Now, why are they called cants, the litanies? This is very interesting. Nearly all of those by Saint Gregory of Narek begin with the word cants, because in each of the stanzas he begins with a letter of his first name, Krikor. So the first stanza will begin with Kim, the second stanza will begin with Re, the third stanza will begin with E. And so this acrostic arrangement, if you were to read the initial letters of each stanza or verse, spell out the author's name. So this, in effect, is the composer's signature. Okay? Krikorie Yerkazais or Krikorie Daazais and so on. So because his name begins with the letter Kim, Krikor, he has to begin with a word that begins with Kim. And his consistent word is kants. Guess what happened? Subsequent composers who also wanted to compose litanies, like Saint Gregory of Narek, they too began their composition with the word kants. And the collection of all these compositions became Kantsara. What this means is that, and this is very important, Saint Gregory of Narek is the progenitor of this genre that we call cants. He's the first person to compose such compositions in 3 parts. So he was a literary genius, and in all estimations, he is considered to be the most prominent Armenian writer of all times. And anyone who reads the writings of Saint Gregory of Narek, understandably of course, cannot help but conclude we have a genius in the person of Saint Gregory of Narek. So we have the Davs, we have the Kants, and we have the Nerpolyan, the panegyrics. He has 5 of those, and these are very important, lengthy prose compositions, again composed for major feasts. The first one is a historical composition. It's on the history of the cross of Abarank. Abarank is a region around Lake Van, where the bishop of the place had a relative who went to serve in the Byzantine army in Constantinople. In order not to feel homesick, he grabbed a handful of soil from around the grave of a deceased ancestor and took it with him. It so turned out that this soil he carried with him had power of miracles, and he became a miracle worker in Constantinople. So everybody there was amazed by what this Armenian fellow has, a handful of soil with which he is performing miracles. And the Byzantines desired to have what the Armenian soldier had. But Armenians are good bargainers. He bargained to let go of this handful of Armenian soil that is capable of working miracles for an actual relic of the cross. So the story or the history is of this relic of the cross, how it was brought to Abarak, and what the bishop Stepanos did by way of preparation to receive in procession this relic that's coming from such a long distance. And St. Gregory's composition, Badmutun Khachin Abaranki or Abaranat, is the history of this relic. And he describes the reliquaries with which this relic came, the artistic arrangements within the chapel and the church that was built for that occasion. So anyone interested in the history of Armenian art, as a documentary history, this is one of our primary sources that describes Armenian art. Detailed description of reliquaries and frescoes and what have you. But more than that, the composition, literally, itself is a treasure. He then has a lengthy encomium on the Holy Cross of Christ. No matter how much you've read about the Cross of Christ, believe me, this is one of the most beautiful things you could ever read on the Cross of Christ. More so when read in the original Armenian. In translation, of course, something is apt to get lost, especially the very beauty of the original classical language. But it is a great composition. There is a composition on the Blessed Virgin Mary, one of the most beautiful things ever written on the Virgin Mary. There's a composition on the 12 apostles. What do these apostles really mean for us Armenians? And the fifth of these panegyrics, or encomia, or Armenian Neapolitan, is dedicated to St. James of Nisibis. St. James of Nisibis in Armenian is Surpagop Mtspana Hayrabet. Nisibis is the ancient region where the convent of Nareg is, that whole area south of Lake Van. So St. James of Nisibis, or Mtspin in Armenian, is the patron saint of that area. So how wonderful and necessary it is to have something composed for the patron saint. And I don't have time to tell you how much St. James of Nisibis is made of and what he means in our Armenian tradition, even to the point of Armenians claiming him to be a cousin of St. Gregory the Luminary. All right, so I have prepared all these, and what I have in my translations of these festal compositions, just to make sure the reader understands what he or she reads, I have a paragraph, or at most a page-long introduction, preparing the reader for what follows, so the reader would read intelligently. And that is very important, because if you don't have that religious introduction to what you are about to read, chances are you wouldn't understand what you're reading, or else you will simply take it as a poem or a literary piece, very much as is often done by certain scholars who have little or no knowledge of medieval theology, much less biblical understanding, as it was among Armenian monastic establishments in the Middle Ages. So it's apt for one to misunderstand what one reads. So these are very important introductions to each of the pieces contained in the book by way of translation. Now I should tell you that something providential also happened in the way this book was published. I'm a member of the Society of Biblical Literature. In fact, in the 1980s, I was the president of this organization in the Midwest region of the US, around Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio. And this organization is the world's largest organization of biblical scholars and theologians. And every 4 years they meet in California. They alternate between San Diego and San Francisco. And in 2014, in November, they meet around Thanksgiving. I attended the meeting in San Diego. One nice thing about these meetings, religious publishers from all over the world and scholars from all over the world, if you want to meet more than 7,000 to 8,000 theologians at one time, go to one of these meetings. There will be more than 100 publishers with their chief editors or even editorial staff in separate booths, and you can imagine what a thrilling place this would be for authors of religious writings looking for a publisher. Not that I was looking for a publisher, but I was there, and I was making my way around these publishers and their exhibits, and there was the liturgical press. The liturgical press happens to be the largest Catholic publisher in North America. And I asked to speak with the chief editor, and I told him what I have. I told him I have a book that contains the festal works of St. Gregory of Narek. I told him everything I know about St. Gregory of Narek. He didn't know anything about him, much less about his writings. And at the end he said, look, you have persuaded me, but there is a whole editorial staff in Minnesota I have to convince. You have to give me 4 months or so, and then you will hear from me whether we'll publish it or not. And I told him that's fine. Some publishers make you wait 2 years before they make up their mind, or even 3 years or 5 years before a book is published. So I said, that's fine. Guess what happened in February 2015? Just when Armenians were preparing to commemorate the centennial of the Armenian genocide, Radio Vatican on February 21 announced what Pope Francis was about to do on that occasion for the Armenian people. He not only called genocide by its right name, much to the dismay of the Turkish authorities, but he did something remarkable, equally remarkable. He elevated St. Gregory of Narek to be a universal theologian for the universal church, or the Catholic Church, in Armenian, Antandragan Yegeretsi. What a remarkable thing. The sad thing, however, is that we Armenians did not grasp the point His Holiness Pope Francis was making. Whereas we Armenians were thinking about our martyred saints of 100 years ago, the Pope took us back 1,000 years, in effect telling us, while you're canonizing your martyred saints of 100 years ago, don't you ever forget your greater saints of 1,000 years ago. In other words, for us Christian Armenians, our identity does not lie in the genocide. Much as we don't want to forget it, and God forbid that we forget what happened to our people 100 years ago. But that's not our identity. Our identity lies in our Christian heritage. Religiously, theologically, literarily, a very rich heritage. That's where our identity lies. The unfortunate thing for us Armenians today is that, and here I speak for all of us Armenians who are alive today, all of us Armenians alive today are still victims of the genocide. Simply because of our preoccupation with the genocide, we have little time and devotion and study or attention given to our greater heritage of centuries ago, where our true identity lies as a Christian people. So insofar as we are deprived of our awareness of that rich heritage, and given our preoccupation with the genocide, more so with the denial of the genocide, we all are still victims of what happened to our people 100 years ago. And I'm sad to say, we didn't get the point Pope Francis was trying to make. Because a year after the centennial, last year, and this last April, we Armenians were still wondering how then to commemorate the genocide now that the centennial is over. We forgot the message of Pope Francis. Take Naregatsi, take Shnorhali, take one of the scores of great Armenian thinkers and theologians of our past. So what do we do a century later? Well, there is Hrant Dink, and God forbid that we minimize the significance of his role and place in our most recent history, and of what he was trying to do within Turkey itself. And then, of course, this year, April 24, we think about the heroic soldiers who gave their lives in Karabakh during the 4-day war. You know about that. But we can go on and on and on with these tragedies, ever forgetting the greater heritage, the rich heritage that is ours as a people. Okay, so much about my book, forget my book, and I forgot my time. Let me just very briefly share with you a few points that help us understand St. Gregory of Nari when we read him. I don't have handouts, I don't have a drawing pad, but you can visualize some of the things I'll be talking about. You know, ever so often he's described as a mystic writer, right? Mystic writer. And for many of us in the English-speaking world, especially in Protestant or evangelical circles, as if the word mystic or mysticism or mystical has become a negative word. Far from it. Sometimes the word mystical is used as a synonym for spiritual, and even the word spiritual is so broad in English usage to the point that It is applied to most anything you do meditatively, be it yoga or whatever. These late definitions of the word mystical or mysticism do not do justice for what we have in mystical theology or in mystical thinkers of the Middle Ages like Saint Gregory of Narek. Mystical thinkers are those who think about God in terms of ever trying to understand God, yet knowing really well that we will never be able to comprehend God. This doesn't mean you don't try to understand God, but hard as you may try, you will never fully understand God. Why the pursuit when God remains a mystery? Okay? Where do we begin? And I'll share with you where these mystical thinkers of the Middle Ages, of whom Saint Gregory of Narek is one of the greatest. I've read them all, and I dare say he's among the best, if not the best. In fact, he, time-wise, chronologically, predates all the great mystical thinkers of the Middle Ages. If you're familiar with any one of them, be they Greek writers or Latin writers or Muslim writers in Arabic or Jewish writers. He precedes them all. But where do they begin? This is where they begin. 2 Bible verses. They're not limited to these 2. I'm just telling you the starting points. 2 Bible verses constitute the starting point for this kind of thinking. One is Genesis 1, verse 27. God created man and woman in his image, right? You know the verse. The question then is, what is the image of God in us human beings? After all, we're created after the image of God. The answer to this question, ever since Hellenistic Judaism in the time of Jesus, an interpretation which was taken over by all Christian writers, all the church fathers of the early church, without any exception, interpreted this verse the same. That is, the image of God in us is our mind, is our intellect, is our capacity to think. This is what distinguishes us from other creatures. All right? Think about it. If your mind, your thinking capacity or ability is the image of God in you, what would this then crave for? But the very image of which it is a reflection. To seek the archetype of this image that is in us. In other words, if you are a thinking person, your best thoughts have to be about God. It's amazing. If you begin to think like that, the very dynamics of your thought can become overwhelming indeed. That this divine thing in you is in search of the divine. All right, that's one verse. The other verse is its parallel. Genesis 2, verse 7. And God breathed in this very creature that He made, and it became a living being. God breathed the breath of God. And again, the question for interpretation is, there is a breath of God in us. What is this breath of God in us? Believe it or not, it was given the same interpretation. Whether the image of God or the breath of God in us is one and the same thing. It's our mind, our intellect, our capacity to think. Isn't it wonderful? And for Christian mystics, there were two other pillars in this thought. And these two pillars are the two sacraments of the primitive church or of the New Testament. You know, forget the idea that in the church there are 7 sacraments. That's not biblical, not even part of Armenian tradition. There are only 2 sacraments: baptism and the Eucharist. Okay? So, what do these mean? What do these teach? Okay, let's take them one at a time. Baptism. The best interpretation of baptism in the Bible is given by St. Paul in Romans chapter 6. What happens when you're baptized? Okay, this is what St. Paul says. When we're dipped in the water, which is the literal meaning of baptism, immersed in the water, it is like dying with Christ. When we're in the water, it's like being buried with Christ. And when we're lifted out of the water, it is like being resurrected with Christ into newness of life, and we live a life in Christ. In other words, baptism becomes initiation into discipleship. And discipleship defined as participation in the life of Christ. So when you die with Christ, you're buried with Him, you're resurrected with Him, what's happening to you? You're participating in the life of Christ. You become one with Him. Even as a disciple who follows in the footsteps so closely that you identify with the Master and the Master identifies with the disciple. A good illustration of this is again from St. Paul. You recall his conversion story when in the outskirts of Damascus, the Lord spoke to him. Saul, Saul, that was his name before he became Paul. Why are you persecuting me? Paul was persecuting the followers of Christ. And here Christ says, why are you persecuting me? You see how the Lord identifies with His followers, just as His followers identify with Him. They become one. And how about the Eucharist? What happens to you when you partake of the body and blood of the Lord in a sacramental setting? In the Eucharist, in the Badarak. To take in the body and blood of Christ gives us affinity with Him. Oneness with Him. So these are basically the biblical pillars, if you can think of a cathedral in 4 pillars. In this mystical theology of St. Gregory of Narek. The image of God, the breath of God, what baptism means and what the Eucharist means. All of which give us the sense of identity and participation in the life of Christ or the Lord. So for those who seek that oneness with God, you have all the basic elements, right? There are also at least four basic books of the Bible which also help erect the walls in this cathedral that I'm describing. And I'll very briefly tell you what these biblical books are, but it's not limited to these books. There are portions of scriptures from all over the Bible that these mystical writers utilized interpretively in their thinking. But I'll give you the basic books of the Bible where they further condition this kind of thinking about God. One is the book of Job. This is very significant, especially when you get to the last chapters of the book of Job. In these last chapters of Job, God speaks to Job and his friends, and God says, you don't know much about God, much less how God works. We don't know about God. That's what he says. What's the point then of the book of Job? Since only God knows, God is omniscient, and we humans don't know how God works, we will never know how God works. What then? We leave it to God. What does this mean? Faith. Faith in Armenian Christianity, in Orthodox Christianity, is based on the fact that we don't know all about God. And by leaving it to Him, we indicate our faith. Faith is based on the fact that we do not know. This is quite different or alien to Western way or Protestant way of thinking. In the Western way of thinking, you believe when you are presented with evidence, or when it comes to the Bible with proof text, your faith is based on something you are convinced about. But that isn't faith. That's a conviction. Or in Armenian, hamozun. You're persuaded about something given the evidence. That isn't faith. Faith is when you want to believe even when the evidence isn't there. That constitutes faith in the Armenian or Eastern Christian understanding. The faith based not so much on knowing, but on not knowing. But which does not prevent the quest to know much as we try to know, knowing that we will never ever get to know all about God. So this then becomes a hide and seek game with God, if I may describe it as that. So the book of Job is very important. Another book which is important is the book of Ezekiel. Especially the visions of Ezekiel, when Ezekiel sees a vision of God. And what does Ezekiel see? And how does he describe God? God is seated on a throne that has wheels. In fact, it has wheels within wheels. What does it mean? And this throne is supported by the cherubim all around, angels all around, holding the throne of God on their wings, and this throne has wheels. Can you corner God? Can you ever say, I have arrived at where God is? No. Remember, God's throne has wheels. God is on the move, God is on the go, God is here, there, and everywhere. We can never ever have a handle on God. But still, this doesn't prevent us to go after Him. Interesting enough, this is found also in the book of Daniel. God's throne has wheels. Daniel 7, verse 11, I believe. But be that as it may, this vision of God. We have the same in the vision of God in Isaiah, chapter 6, and other places in Isaiah. But the book of Ezekiel becomes significant. A third book of significance for mystic thinkers is the Song of Songs. Why the Song of Songs? The imagery is in the Song of Songs. Of course, it's a love poem. Literally speaking, that's what it is. But interpretively, of course, in the Christian tradition, it indicates God's love for us humans and our love in return for God. So you have the lover and the beloved in the Song of Songs. What happens between the two? Even when you think you have your beloved within your arms, within your grasp, within your reach, look at the next verse. He isn't there. He's out there on the hills, on the mountains. Isn't that a beautiful thought about God? Even when you think you have your beloved within your grasp, He isn't there. He's out there on the hills. Go find Him. Get others with you to find Him. A fourth book in the Bible, and again, let me say, it's not limited to these books, but these are major books that constitute the walls of this mystical thinking, if you think of it as a cathedral of thought, is the Gospel of John. And why the Gospel of John? I can give you scores of reasons, but let me just give you one or two. In the book of John, the Gospel of John, all the heavenly things we as Christians desire or wish or imagine, to be with God in heavenly places, rightly understood in the Gospel of John, all this is realized eschatology. That is to say, he who believes according to the Gospel of John can experience all these heavenly realities in the here and now. Eternal life is not necessarily just for the hereafter. So a mystic thinker in quest for God and divine things can have this heavenly peace, heavenly reality realized and experienced in the here and now, experientially, existentially. Well, with these thoughts, I want you then to think about an octagon, a chamber of thought that makes the believer of these things in a most conducive place to contemplate God. And what is so amazing about St. Gregory of Narek is not just one book of the Bible or another book of the Bible or one passage here, another passage there, or one pillar here or one pillar there. But all of these converge together in his thought. And what makes all these things I shared with you to this moment come together is the very fact of the incarnation. That is to say, we who are created in the image of God, humans, God himself in Christ partook of our image, became one of us. So this gives us this greater affinity with God, which we ought to ever contemplate. And whatever we contemplate, especially in writing, this becomes our offering to God. To go back to what I said earlier, your thoughts, the very best of your thoughts, ought to be about God. And when you commit these thoughts into writing, these become your offerings to God. And who wants to bring to God anything but his best? And we have St. Gregory of Narek's best. And believe me, they are the best of thoughts about God. Thank you. Thank you. If you have questions, I'll be happy to do so. I was never told when to quit.
No need to.
But we will leave it till we get this signal.
What was the reason for the traffic?
Oh, an overturned.
Yes,
Yes, and it was an
don't waste your time.
overturned truck, one of these huge petroleum carrying trucks. And that has damaged the rail and involved several other cars just by the area called the Pyramid on I-5. Just about half hour north of here. Anyway, it's good to be here with you, and thank you for waiting. Thank you for coming.
Are we going to see any more of the Avant series from St. Narcissus in the future?
Well, let's hope so. St. Narcissus has a couple of series of publications. One is the Avant series, which frankly I started when I was academic dean there. Yes, there are some works in the pipeline. Actually, the next volume will be, hopefully within a year, all of the encyclicals of Saint Narcissus Shnorhali. In Armenian, we call them Untitled Chapter. If you ever think of Saint Narcissus, the gracious, if you ever wonder what the word gracious really means, it is personified in the person of Saint Narcissus and his writings. Not just the charlatans. You have to read his encyclicals. And these encyclicals are addressed not only to bishops or archbishops, they're addressed to everyone. Men, women, soldiers, administrators. He has something for everybody in the Armenian Church. So that's we will have next year, hopefully. And as for the St. Narcissus Theological Review, subsequent issues will be published only electronically. Yes, please. Yes. Yes. St. Gregory of Narek, very early on in his book, talks about healing powers to those who believe and pray these prayers or join him in praying these prayers. And in so many Armenian homes for generations, there is this tradition of keeping a copy of the prayer book under the pillow, especially of the sick. So the place of Saint Gregory of Narek in Armenian traditions is overwhelming. But it's not just something magical about this book. One has to understand what he is praying. In fact, there's a saying by Saint Nerses Shnorhali. He says, if you don't understand what you're praying, then you haven't prayed. It's in the preface of his Havadov Hostovanim. We know the prayer Havadov Hostovanim. We read it, but we don't read the 2-page preface, in which he says basically 2 things. He says, if you're a Christian, you ought to pray. You cannot claim to be a Christian and go about your day without praying. And he says, I know you are a busy person, everybody has things to do. You may not have time to pray so many times a day. Pray at least once. You need not even pray this whole prayer. Just pray one stanza, a couple of lines, that should be enough. But as a Christian, you can't go about without praying. That's point 1. Point 2, in his preface to Havadov Hostovanim, by faith I confess, he says, if you don't understand what you're praying, then you haven't prayed. Now we have to tell this to the Catholicos, who should allow us to pray in English in the Armenian Church, or else, according to Saint Nerses Shnorhali, we haven't prayed. Yes, please.
Was he influenced with earlier theologians before him in the earlier times of Christianity? Like maybe...
Yes, no doubt. He has read nearly every church father translated into Armenian. And among the most favorite fathers of the early church in the Armenian tradition are the Cappadocian fathers, namely St. Basil of Caesarea, St. Gregory the theologian, Gregory of Nyssa. The writings of these church fathers are overwhelming. For an Armenian who knows about the Reformation and the Protestant tradition and the evangelical background, but who doesn't know the Cappadocian fathers, I'd say you have missed something in the history and the heritage of Christianity that we as Armenians have. In fact, I could tell you a lot of what these church fathers meant to our Armenian fathers, who become the seminal thoughts for many of these things we find in our Armenian writings. And they are very important because our Armenian fathers defined orthodoxy by church fathers, Greek church fathers, who lived and wrote before the 5th century, before the Council of Chalcedon of 451. So much so that their Greek interlocutors, or the Greek theologians on the other side, who define orthodoxy in terms of Chalcedonian Christology, cannot argue with them, because if you argue against what the Armenians are presenting, those Greek Byzantine theologians will be arguing against their own church fathers. And so when the Armenians won the theological arguments, the Byzantines twisted the dialogue. The dialogue became not about theology, not about Christology, but about liturgy, or liturgical practicum. You Armenians don't mix water in your Eucharistic wine, or you Armenians don't use leavened bread in your Eucharist, and on and on and on. So these early church fathers, especially the Cappadocians fathers, in addition to St. John Chrysostom and others, they loom large in our Armenian patristic tradition. Yes?
Where do you situate Saint Gregory? Is the Christian mystical tradition? Is it the Apostolic or the Catholic?
That's a very good question. You know, in most books you read about mysticism or mystical theology or medieval mystics collectively. They seem to lump together Christian mystics, Jewish mystics, Arab, Muslim mystics, and no doubt there are some common elements in mystical writings. But here is something very important. I, for one, would not place Christian mystics in the same category for two reasons. This very notion of the image of God and the breath of God and the Eucharist and baptism, these four pillars that I mentioned, these you don't have in Jewish mysticism or in Islamic mysticism, right? What you have common in Islamic and Jewish mysticism and some Latin mystical writers, not Greek or Orthodox Christian writers, is that they carry on Neoplatonic thinking promoted by a fellow named Plotinus around 400 AD, and then further carried on by another writer that followed and on, and it diverts into Western Christian mysticism. And the same tradition is taken over by Muslim mystics and Jewish mystics. Some of you have heard about Kabbalah mysticism. That's medieval Jewish mysticism that is post-10th century. And it differs from Christian or even Islamic mysticism in that it becomes, dare I say, spooky, magical, irrational. That's not what we have. What we have in Christian mysticism is both descent and ascent. The descent and ascent is first and most foremost in the creation of humanity in the image of the divine, okay? We have a heavenly thing reflected on earth in what we call the human race. So there is a divine, higher element, heavenly, within the earthly, in humanity. So you have this descent. And awareness of this descent of the image of God enables the ascent contemplatively to go after God. So there is both the katabastic and the anabastic. These are Greek words which means descent and ascent. And all this is further conditioned by the fact that we have the incarnation. God himself became human. Isn't it amazing that we humans, created after the image of God, here comes God and takes over our fallen image as we are. that this image of God in us, even though it was tarnished, it was damaged because of the fall or sin, but this image was never eradicated, never wiped out. It's always there, and Christ came to restore it. And that's the meaning of the word redemption, or in English, salvation. In Greek, this word we in English call salvation, or in Armenian perkutiun, literally means to restore. To restore what? This damaged image, shattered though it be, it's not all lost, it's not all wiped out. And therefore, redemption is the restoration of this divine images. So it's both. Well, thank you very much. Our time is almost over. I must admit, I noticed your hand long ago, and we have this one final question.
Okay. I've got two questions. Both of them come from the introductory remarks that you made today.
Okay.
One was in the context of kans, dals, and sharagans. You made a remark that it was enough to include material in the sharagan, so they stopped something. Okay?
You have to draw the line somewhere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you say that that line, when it was drawn, it had something to do with the Eastern Church and the Western Church, and the Armenian Church? Eastern being represented by Vana Shoshana, and the Western by the Giriya Shoshana. And at the time, there was a lot of philosophical differences and so forth, and maybe that was a factor where to draw the line. That's my first question. And
Let me answer this one. I agree with you that with the continuity of the Catholic Apostle See in Cilicia, and with Saint Narcissus the Gracious and his kin, six of his relatives succeeded him. And they were all named Krikor, after the first Krikor, Vagaser, who himself claimed kinship with Saint Grigor the First, the Illuminator. And historically there is this kinship. So for roughly 200 years, the successors of Saint Nerses Shnorali were his kin. And so the church in Kilikia and the Catholicos there had tried the way this kinship continued. Yes?
okay. And the second question is within the context of you're trying to characterize Narek and God, and the conversations and so forth, and you used quite a few words. One word, in my opinion, wasn't there. I'd like to know why not. Okay? And that is that as I read Narek, especially in the Madhyan, I also see an element of negotiation between him and God. And somehow that word didn't appear in your descriptions. And
Okay.
okay.
I think I did it because when I defined what we mean by prayer, or the prayer book, or even the Armenian phrase, Hoskand Astudzo, this Hoskand Astudzo is a dialogue, it's a conversation. It's asking God questions. So there is this kind of discourse between him and God. And here again, what happens at the end of this mystical contemplation, even when you think you have arrived at God, however remotely, the ultimate awareness is a contrast between God and his divinity and us humans with all of our infirmity. And so this is where one yields to God. And there is something also beautiful, but to your second point, I think I covered your second question. I said something in the course of my presentation like a game of hide and seek. I like that illustration because God is there and we are called upon to find Him. Much as we search, we come short of finding Him in His fullness. God remains incomprehensible. In Armenian, Animanali, Anhasaneli. All right? So what happens? You begin to think, okay, I'm thinking about going after God in my quest for God, in my search for God, and I come short. How about Him looking for me? I grew up in Jerusalem in the St. James Convent. How many of you have been there? It's an old city within the old city of Jerusalem. If you think about the narrow alleys of the old city of Jerusalem, wait till you go deep within St. James Monastery in Jerusalem. In all of these narrows, we as kids, we had little toys, hardly any toys to speak of. One of the favorite games was hide and seek. And what a wonderful place to play hide and seek. And ever so often, I must admit, when I was looking for my friends who were hiding, I had to give up. And guess what I did? I went and hid myself and waited for them to come out from where they were hiding to look for me. And that made it all the more intriguing. So, thank God for the incarnation. This God comes down to us. He identifies with us. He goes through all that we go through in our humanity. He participates in our life much as we participate in His life. And one Armenian word we Armenian believers ought to be ever mindful of, and which means a lot, and it's a loaded word theologically, is the word havortutun. Havortutun is participation in the life of Christ, in the life of God. And that's what a believer experiences. Thank you very much.